The year was 1910, and the Ozarks in southern Missouri felt like a world set apart from everything else. The air was thick with pine and mist, the kind that never seemed to lift, no matter how bright the sun got. Life there moved slowly, in rhythm with the woods, quiet, steady, and full of secrets. The people who lived in those hills trusted the land more than they trusted strangers. They built their homes from logs, worked the soil with their hands, and prayed that the mountains would be kind to them each season. But when winter came, and the winds howled through the hollows, the forest would whisper things that made even the toughest men stay close to their fires. That winter was harsher than usual. The nights seemed longer, and the silence in the woods wasn't like before. It felt heavy, as if something unseen was waiting. Near the edge of the Mark Twain forest sat a small settlement known as Ember Hollow. It wasn't on any map, but about a dozen families called it home. They lived off the land, trapping, logging, and sometimes selling moonshine to make ends meet. Life there was simple, but not peaceful. Strange things had been happening for years. Missing livestock, half-eaten deer carcasses found miles from hunting trails, footprints too large to belong to any man. The older folks whispered stories about a creature that had always lived in the forest long before them. A tall, hairy figure that walked upright and screamed like a woman when the moon was high. Most brushed it off as folklore, a way to scare kids from wandering too deep. But a few believed, especially the older generation, those who claimed their parents spoke of the curse of the forest people. They said there once was a tribe that lived hidden among the trees long before settlers came, a quiet people untouched by the outside world. Then one year they vanished. No remains, no trace, just gone. And not long after that, the strange sightings began. The locals called it the Sasquatch curse, saying the tribe's anger still haunted the woods that took them. In Ember Hollow, talk like that was mostly kept behind closed doors, but that didn't mean it wasn't felt. Everyone in that place carried an unease they couldn't explain, a quiet fear that pressed against the back of their minds when the forest went still. The one who felt it most was a man named Silas Crow. He was 32, a logger with a scar across his temple and hands rougher than bark. He wasn't born there. He came from down near Springfield after losing his wife in childbirth. Folks said he came to start over, but he never seemed to fit. He kept to himself, spoke little, and spent long stretches in the woods alone. Some said he was searching for something. Others said he was running from it. Then there was the Harlan family, the heart of the settlement. Amos Harlan owned the sawmill that kept the town alive. He was a proud man, broad-shouldered with a voice that carried through the valley. His wife, Mabel, was quiet and watchful, the kind of woman who saw things before others did but rarely spoke of them. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. The eldest, Eli, had just turned 16, restless and sharp-tongued. He hated Ember Hollow, hated the silence, the isolation. He'd talk about leaving for the city someday, where there were lights and noise, and people who didn't speak in whispers. Despite the closeness of the settlement, the people there weren't truly close. They depended on each other for survival, but trust was rare. Secrets ran deep, and grudges older than most of the children still shaped how neighbors looked at one another. There was one family, the Lyles, who lived on the far side of the creek. Folks said they were touched, that bad luck followed them like a shadow. Livestock dying, fires starting from nowhere, their youngest child vanishing one night without a sound. Some swore it was the forest taking back what was owed. Others thought the Lyles brought it on themselves. In a place like Ember Hollow, fear was something everyone learned to live with. They feared hunger, the cold, and most of all, the woods. But that fear had become a kind of background noise over the years, something everyone pretended not to hear. Until the day the hunters found the campsite. It was late February when it happened. A group of men had gone tracking a black bear near the northern ridge. They found the bear's tracks all right, but they also found something else. A circle of stones, blackened from a fire that hadn't gone out clean. Around it were bones, not animal, but human. Small, too small to belong to a grown man. The men said there were carvings on the stones, symbols none of them recognized, carved deep, as if by hands that didn't want them to fade. When the men came back to town, they didn't speak much. Just said they'd found something strange and burned the site before leaving. But Ember Hollow was small and word spread fast. Some said it was an old burial site. Others said it was the remains of that vanished tribe, unearthed by the winter storms. Silas Crow said nothing, though witnesses later recalled seeing him staring toward the northern ridge that night, his face lit by his cabin fire, unmoving for hours. The next morning, the Harlan girl went missing. At first, everyone thought she had just wandered off, maybe to pick berries or follow her brothers to the creek. But as hours turned to days, that fragile calm that held Ember Hollow together began to crack. Men started searching with torches, calling her name through the trees. Dogs howled and refused to go further past the ridge. The wind carried strange echoes, and some swore they heard laughter, a child's voice, distant but clear. The woods, once a place of work and routine, became something else entirely, a breathing, waiting thing. And though no one said it out loud, everyone knew deep down what they feared most. Whatever took that child wasn't a man. And if the stories were true, something old had awakened in those hills again. The search for the Harlan girl went on for 3 days. By the 4th, hope had already started to fade. Men trudged back from the ridge with torn coats and hollow eyes, saying the same thing: they found nothing, no footprints, no fabric, no blood. It was as if she had been lifted right off the ground. The only thing left behind was her ribbon caught on a low branch near the creek, fluttering in the cold wind. Mabel Harlan held that ribbon like it was a part of her daughter's soul, refusing to let go even when Amos begged her to rest. As the days turned to weeks, Ember Hollow began to rot from the inside out. People started blaming each other. Some whispered that the Lyles were cursed and had called the darkness back into the woods. Others said Sela's crow had something to do with it, that he'd been seen near the ridge before the girl disappeared. Silas didn't deny it. He just said he'd been hunting, same as any man. But there was something in his eyes, a kind of haunted calm that made people uneasy. The Harlans stopped speaking to anyone. Amos rarely left the mill. His face grew harder, the lines deeper. He'd stand at the edge of the woods each night, lantern in hand, staring into the dark as though he could will his daughter to step out from between the trees. He refused to believe she was gone. "She's out there," he'd say to anyone who came near. "She just can't find her way back." But Mabel knew better. She could feel it, the same way she could sense storms before they came. Whatever had taken their child wasn't something that would let her go. Rumors twisted like vines through the valley. People claimed to hear noises at night, low growls that turned into human cries. One man swore he saw a shape move between the trees, tall and wide, with glowing eyes. Another said his dog went missing after barking all night at something he couldn't see. Fear spread faster than the truth ever could, and soon the settlement began to break apart. Silas became the center of it. He'd always been an outsider, but now that difference turned dangerous. One night, a group of men came to his cabin, led by Eli Harlan. They were drunk, armed with axes and shotguns. Eli shouted through the door, accusing Silas of hiding his sister's body. He said Silas was seen near the creek again, that he'd been digging. Silas opened the door slowly, his face shadowed by firelight. He didn't threaten them. He just looked at Eli and said, "If you keep calling for what you don't understand, boy, something going to answer you." The words were calm, but they cut like a knife. The men left after that, but not before Eli threw a stone that cracked one of Silas's windows. That night, a storm came. Thunder rolled across the hills like the growl of something alive. Silas stayed inside, sitting by the fire, reading from a small leather book he kept hidden under the floorboards. It wasn't a Bible. The pages were yellowed, filled with strange markings and hand-drawn symbols that matched the carvings found at the campsite weeks before. His lips moved silently, whispering names that no one else in Ember Hollow would have recognized. The next morning, the Harlan sawmill caught fire. The blaze spread fast, too fast for anyone to stop. By the time the flames died down, nothing was left but a black skeleton of wood and smoke. Amos barely escaped. His arm burned badly. Everyone assumed it was an accident until someone noticed the strange pattern burned into the earth near the mill. It looked like a circle with shapes inside that no one could explain. That's when the whispers turned into fear and fear turned into hate. Amos swore vengeance. He believed Silas had cursed his family, that the man had brought darkness into Ember Hollow. He gathered what men he could, Eli among them, and promised to drive Silas out or kill him if he had to. Mabel tried to stop him, but Amos wouldn't listen. Something inside him had snapped. Losing the mill was one thing, but losing his daughter had hollowed him out. What was left of him wanted blood. Meanwhile, Eli had changed. The restless, sharp-tongued boy was gone. He started keeping to himself, spending hours in the woods where his sister vanished. He claimed he could hear her voice in the wind, calling his name, leading him deeper each time. His friends followed him once, but they turned back when he began talking to the trees, whispering that the tribe was real and they were coming back. When asked what he meant, Eli just smiled, eyes wide and unfocused. "They said she's not gone," he whispered. "She's with them now." As the settlement grew more desperate, more strange things began happening. Livestock were found mutilated, their hides torn as if by giant claws. A logging cart overturned one morning, killing one of the workers, his body twisted in a way no accident could explain. The men refused to go back into the forest after that. Even the dogs wouldn't cross the creek. Mabel began to see things, too. She said she'd wake in the night and find muddy footprints leading from the door to her bed. She said she could hear her daughter humming near the window, a soft tune that stopped the moment she lit a lamp. She told Amos, but he dismissed it as grief. Yet even he couldn't explain why the footprints never matched his boots or anyone else's in the house. Then one evening, Mabel went to the church at the center of Ember Hollow. She found Silas there, kneeling near the altar. He didn't look surprised to see her. "You can feel it too," he said quietly. "It's not done yet." Mabel demanded to know what he meant, what was happening to her family, to the settlement. Silas told her a story then, one that had been passed down by his grandfather. About a tribe that once lived in the same hills, people who believed the forest was alive, that it listened and remembered. When white settlers began cutting the trees and digging up the land, the tribe performed a ritual to bind their spirits to the woods. They said they'd return if their home was ever defiled again. "They never left," Silas whispered. "You just stopped seeing them." Mabel didn't believe him, not fully, but she saw something in his face that frightened her more than his words. It wasn't madness. It was known. She left without another word. That night she dreamed of her daughter standing in the forest, eyes black as pitch, smiling. By next week the settlement had fallen into chaos. Families started packing, leaving before nightfall. But those who stayed grew meaner, harder. Old grudges resurfaced. Neighbors accused neighbors of witchcraft, of secret pacts, of bringing the curse back. The woods seemed to press closer each day, as if swallowing Ember Hollow whole. Then came the night of the second disappearance. Eli Harlan vanished just like his sister. One moment he was sitting by the fire with his father, silent and distant. Next he was gone. Amos searched through the night, calling his son's name until his voice broke. He found nothing but a small charm hanging from a tree branch, a carving of a human figure made of twigs and hair. When he brought it back to the others, Silas was already waiting near the creek, his expression calm, unreadable. "What did you do?" Amos shouted, gripping him by the collar. Silas didn't fight back. He only said, "I didn't take them. The woods did. And now it's too late to stop what's coming." By morning, Silas's cabin was burned to the ground. No one admitted to doing it, but everyone knew who had. The fire raged until nothing was left but ash and the faint smell of something foul, like burned hair and wet earth. That should have been the end of it, but it was. 2 nights later, the people of Ember Hollow woke to screams coming from the ridge. Deep, guttural sounds that echoed across the valley. Some said it was a bear. Others said it was human. Amos grabbed his rifle and went toward the sound, his lantern swinging in the dark. He never came back. By dawn, only Mabel was left in the Harlan house. The town was unraveling, families fleeing into the hills or vanishing altogether. And through it all, the woods watched, silent, waiting, patient. The men who survived those weeks swore that something in the forest had changed. They said they saw shadows moving even when the trees were still, heard whispers beneath the wind. And they began to understand what Silas meant when he said the woods remembered. Because Ember Hollow wasn't just dying, it was being reclaimed. The night Amos Harlan disappeared, the air felt different. Heavy, charged. The kind of night when even the crickets go silent and the trees seem to lean closer to listen. Mabel sat by the window, staring at the dark line of the forest that swallowed the horizon. Her lamp flickered weakly, casting small shadows that moved like fingers across the walls. She hadn't slept in days. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her daughter, standing at the tree line, barefoot, face pale, hair tangled with leaves, beckoning her closer. Sometimes she'd hear Eli's voice too, whispering from the dark, saying he'd found her, that they were together now. The others in Ember Hollow had already begun to leave. Only a handful of cabins still had light that night, and Mabel was one of them. She knew she should go, but something deep inside her wouldn't let her. She couldn't leave without knowing what happened, without answers. She sat there until the candle burned down to a stub and the forest outside began to breathe again, long, slow gusts of wind moving through the trees like sighs. Then she heard it. A knock 3 times, slow and steady. Her heart clenched. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. No one had come to her door in days. She rose carefully, her hands trembling, and called out, "Amos?" There was no answer, only the wind. She stepped closer, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. The knock came again, this time harder. When she opened the door, no one was there. Only the woods, black and endless, but in the distance she saw it, a light flickering between the trees like a lantern swaying back and forth. Her breath caught. "Amos," she whispered. She didn't think. She just grabbed her shawl, lit her own lantern, and stepped out into the night. The forest swallowed her whole. The deeper she went, the quieter it became. The ground was soft under her boots, the smell of damp leaves thick in the air. The light ahead moved slowly, always just far enough that she couldn't see who held it. She followed anyway, whispering her husband's name, her daughter's, her son. Each time, the wind seemed to answer her back in faint echoes. Then, after what felt like hours, the light stopped. Mabel reached a clearing she'd never seen before. In the center stood a circle of stones, the same kind the hunters had found weeks ago. The symbols carved into them glowed faintly, pulsing like embers. At first, she thought it was a trick of the lantern light, but then she saw the figures. 3 of them, standing just beyond the circle. She dropped her lantern and the flame sputtered out. The clearing was washed in pale moonlight now and she could see clearly. The smallest of the figures stepped forward, her daughter, her hair matted, skin gray and waxy, eyes hollow and shining. Behind her stood Eli, his face slack and expressionless, a shadow moving under his skin like something alive. The third figure was Amos, or what was left of him. His clothes were torn, his mouth twisted as though trying to speak, but no sound came out. Mabel stumbled backward, choking on her breath. "No, this isn't real," she whispered. The forest answered her with a low rumble, like the ground itself was groaning. Her children stepped closer, their heads tilting in unison. Then Amos moved too, reaching out his blackened hand. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice warped and echoing as if spoken through water. Mabel screamed. The sound tore through the night, sharp and desperate. She turned and ran, but the woods around her shifted, twisting the path, leading her in circles. The trees looked wrong now, bent, gnarled, their bark moving like flesh. She could hear footsteps behind her, slow and heavy, the snap of branches breaking under a weight too large to be human. And then came the smell, rotting earth, blood, wet fur. She burst into a small hollow where the moonlight barely reached. Her lungs burned. She pressed her back against a tree, clutching her shawl. The sounds grew louder, breathing, heavy animal-like. When she turned, she saw it. At first, she thought it was a man, but no man could be that tall, that broad. Its body was covered in thick, matted hair, its eyes deep red, glowing faintly in the dark. The air around it vibrated, carrying a low hum that made her ears ring. It took a step forward, the ground trembling under its weight. Mabel froze, unable to scream. It was close enough now that she could see its face, or what looked like one. It wasn't just beastly, it was human too. Its jaw, its nose, its shape, she saw pieces of faces she recognized. Amos, Eli, her daughter. The creature opened its mouth and released a sound that wasn't a roar but a chorus, a blend of voices, layered and distorted, crying and laughing all at once. The voices of the lost, the vanished tribe, the children. Mabel dropped to her knees, shaking uncontrollably. "Please," she whispered, "take me, just let them go." For a moment everything went still. The air stopped moving. The forest went silent. The creature lowered itself, bringing its face close to hers. Its breath was hot and foul, smelling of decay. Then, in a voice that wasn't entirely its own, it said softly, "They belong to the woods now." The ground split beneath her. The soil turned soft, pulling her down. She screamed again, clawing at the roots, the dirt filling her mouth, her eyes. The creature watched as she sank, motionless, until only her hand remained above the ground, and even that slowly disappeared. The forest swallowed her whole, just as it had taken the others. By dawn, the clearing was empty. The stones were cold again, and the symbols faded. But the earth was disturbed, a mound where someone or something had been buried. When the few remaining families in Ember Hollow came searching later that day, they found her lantern near the edge of the woods, glass cracked, the flame long gone. They followed the faint trail of footprints to the clearing, but it ended abruptly, as if she had vanished mid-step. They found no bodies, only traces, pieces of clothing, a burnt shawl, a strand of hair tangled in a root. And in the middle of the stone circle, someone or something had carved new symbols overnight. This time there were more of them, enough to count every person who'd gone missing. Panic broke what little was left of the settlement. By the week's end, Ember Hollow was abandoned. Cabins left open, fires still smoldering. The forest reclaimed everything in silence. Months later, when a small group of outsiders wandered into the valley, they found the place eerily untouched, as if frozen in time. But when they entered the woods, the smell of decay hit them like a wall. One of them found a human skull half buried near the ridge, its jaw locked in what looked like a scream. The others said it must have been wild animals, a tragedy of the wilderness. But that night when they camped near the creek, one of the men woke to laughter. A child's laughter, high, echoing, distant. He called out, thinking it was one of his companions, but no one answered. He looked toward the trees and saw figures moving between them, tall and slow, their eyes glowing faintly red. The next morning, only 2 of them made it back to town. They never spoke about what they saw, but one of them, an old man years later, said that the forest in Ember Hollow was alive, that the missing weren't gone. They had simply become part of something older, something waiting. And if you stood in the clearing on a quiet night, he said, you could still hear them whispering, voices of the vanished tribe, the children, the lost, calling out softly through the trees, asking anyone who listened one simple question. Do you remember us? Spring came late that year. By the time the snow melted and the rivers swelled, Ember Hollow was little more than a ghost town. The forest had already started reclaiming what the people left behind, vines crawling up cabin walls, moss swallowing the fences, and the wind whistling through broken windows like the breath of something living. The place that once echoed with the sound of saws and children's laughter now lay silent, as if the earth itself wanted to forget. Few who escaped the valley carried the story with them, though none could tell it the same way. Some swore the Harlan family had gone mad, that grief and isolation drove them into the woods to die. Others whispered that the old curse was real, that the forest had finally taken back what was stolen from it. And a few, mostly those who'd seen the strange symbols burned into the ground or heard the laughter in the distance, refused to speak at all. They packed up, moved away, and never set foot in the Ozarks again. One of them was Jacob Lyle, the last of the Lyle family. He was only 14 when it happened, a boy who'd seen more than he should have. His parents vanished that same winter, but he never spoke of how or when. Years later, he told a sheriff in Springfield that he remembered standing by his window that night and watching lanterns move through the trees, dozens of them, weaving in silence like a funeral procession. He said he saw the shapes following behind, tall and slow, and he heard voices calling his name. He packed what he could and ran until sunrise. In the months that followed, county officials finally went to investigate. They found burned remains of cabins, abandoned tools, and food left to rot on tables. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, just the forest, dense and quiet as though guarding its secrets. A few of the deputies refused to go near the northern ridge after one of them claimed to hear a woman crying from beneath the soil. The local papers covered it briefly. Settlement vanishes in Ozark wilderness. A strange story, but not strange enough to stay on the front page for long. Most people dismissed it as superstition, a cautionary tale about frontier life gone wrong. But those who'd known Ember Hollow, the traders, hunters, and travelers who'd passed through, remembered the people there. They spoke of the Harlans as good folks, hardworking and proud. The thought of them vanishing without a trace didn't sit right. Rumors turned into legends, and legends became warnings. Don't linger too long in the Ozark woods, the old men would say by the fire. The trees there remember names. For Mabel Harlan, there was no grave, no funeral, no marker to show she had ever lived. The preacher from the nearest town tried to hold a small service for the missing, but the church stood nearly empty. It felt wrong to pray for souls that the forest had claimed. Some said it was best to let them rest where they were, that digging up the past would only make things worse. Others, in hushed tones, said the Harlans got what was coming, that they'd angered the land by taking too much, by cutting too deep into the trees that weren't theirs to touch. Silas Crow's name became something whispered, too. After his cabin was burned, no one saw him again. The sheriff's men searched the ashes but found no bones. Some believed he'd fled into the hills. Others claimed he'd become part of what he'd been warning them about, that he'd joined the tribe beneath the trees. Years later, a hunter stumbled upon an old journal half buried in the mud near the creek. The pages were waterlogged and faded, but one line could still be read clearly. They are not gone. They've simply changed shape. Time dulled the edges of the story, but it never erased it. Decades later, when new settlers tried to build near the same ridge, the land resisted them. Foundations would crack overnight. Livestock would wander into the forest and never return. A few men claimed to see shapes standing between the trees when the mist rolled in, tall, motionless, watching. No one stayed for long. The area earned a new name over time, the Vanished Hollow. The story spread across Missouri like wildfire, told in whispers and campfire tales. Some called it a haunting, others a curse. Parents warned their children not to wander too far. Hunters left offerings at the edge of the woods before going in bread, coins, or small carvings of wood. They said it was for good luck, but deep down it was something older, a gesture of respect. For those who had escaped Ember Hollow, life never truly went back to normal. Jacob Lyle grew up with the memory carved deep into his mind. He couldn't bear the sound of the wind through the trees or the sight of mist in the morning. He took to living in towns, surrounded by people, far from the woods. Yet even then, sometimes he'd wake in the middle of the night and swear he heard it again, the laughter of children echoing faintly in his ears. He died in 1941, still insisting that the forest was alive, still warning anyone who would listen to stay away from the northern ridge. The official records never listed Ember Hollow as anything more than an abandoned settlement. No mention of the disappearances, no mention of the strange carvings or the stories told by the survivors. It was easier that way, easier to believe it was a tragedy caused by hunger, disease, or desperation. The kind of thing that happened often in those times. People preferred simple explanations. They didn't want to think about curses or creatures or the land, remembering what was taken from it. But even now, more than a century later, hikers who stray too deep into that part of the Ozarks sometimes return with stories. They talk about feeling watched, about hearing soft voices calling their names when no one else is around. Some find odd symbols carved into tree trunks, their shapes half hidden under moss. A few have even found old trinkets buried in the soil, ribbons, hairpins, rusted tools, things that shouldn't have survived that long. Every few years, a journalist or historian tries to dig into what really happened in Ember Hollow. They search for birth records, land deeds, letters, anything that proves the settlement existed. But each time they come up with almost nothing. The names are faded, the records missing. It's as if the place was erased piece by piece from history, and maybe that's what the forest wanted all along, to be left alone, to forget. Still, for those who grew up hearing the tale, the fear remains. Not the kind that makes you scream, but the kind that lingers when the woods go quiet. The kind that makes you wonder what the earth hides beneath its roots. They say on certain nights, when the moon is full and the air turns still, you can see faint lights moving through the trees, like lanterns, drifting in silence. Some claim it's the spirits of the Harlans still searching for each other. Others believe it's the old tribe walking their land once more. But the oldest folks, the ones who have heard the story passed down for generations, say it's both. The vanished tribe and the lost settlers, now one and the same, bound to the forest that took them. And if you stand too long at the edge of those woods, if you listen hard enough, you might hear a voice calling from deep within, soft, familiar, almost human, asking the same question that's haunted the Ozarks for over 100 years. Do you remember us? By the end of that long autumn, the Ozarks were a place of silence. The forest that once hummed with night creatures, with the laughter of children and the low crackle of fires, now stood still, as though the trees themselves had seen too much and refused to speak. What happened in those woods in 1910 remained half-truth and half-legend, but for the families who lived through it, no one could pretend it was just folklore anymore. The vanished tribe, as the newspapers called them, was no longer a whisper. It became a curse, a story passed down through generations to remind people that evil doesn't always come wearing a monster's face. Sometimes it comes wearing your neighbor. When the lawmen arrived from Springfield weeks after the last known disappearance, all they found were traces. A campsite torn apart, ash mixed with bone fragments and prints too large to belong to any man. They called in trackers, scientists, and even priests. Everyone came up with different answers, but none of them brought comfort. The surviving families demanded justice, but justice needed a suspect, and none remained. Some believed the families who vanished had become victims of a cult, others claimed a wild beast had taken them, and a few whispered that they had turned on each other out of fear, paranoia, and hunger. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became that the truth was not simple. It was layered, tangled, and cruel. By winter, the forest was cordoned off by the county. The sheriff, who had once been certain that men, not monsters, were responsible, began to doubt his own beliefs. His deputies reported hearing voices echo through the trees like chanting in a language no one could place. Tracks appeared in fresh snow, circling their camp, leading back toward the same hollow where the tribe had built their homes. After one deputy vanished, the search quietly stopped. Officially, the case was left open and ongoing. Unofficially, it was buried. Years later, the land changed hands. Farmers came and went, never lasting long. The soil yielded nothing but rot. Those who lived near the border of the old tribal grounds said their animals grew sick, that lights flickered through the trees at night, and that a figure, tall, shadowed, and reeking of smoke, stood by their window if they dared to speak of the past. To them, the Sasquatch curse wasn't about a beast in the woods, it was about guilt. About the sins of people who came to take land that wasn't theirs, and the blood that soaked it long before they arrived. As the decades passed, the story grew into myth. Children dared each other to spend nights near the hollow. Men told stories by firelight about the tribe that vanished after mocking something ancient and wild. But among the older generations, especially those whose kin had been part of the settlement, there was a quiet rule: don't go past the river after dark. Not because of monsters, but because some things never died right. In the end, the case was never solved. No bodies were recovered. No clear evidence was ever found. But those who studied the surviving journals and testimonies came to a haunting realization. Before their disappearance, the tribe had become consumed by fear and division. They accused one another of betrayal, of witchcraft, of calling down something dark upon the forest. They began locking their doors from the inside. They burned their own crops. Some wrote of seeing a man-beast watching from the ridge, while others confessed that it looked like one of their own. The final journal entry, written by the tribe's eldest, carried a line that investigators never forgot. "The forest is not cursed, we are." Justice in the traditional sense was never served. There were no trials, no confessions, no clear villains, only consequences. The sheriff retired, plagued by nightmares and guilt for not finding the missing families. The nearby town of Holly's Creek never recovered its sense of peace. It shrank year by year until only ruins and silence remained. Local pastors used the tragedy as a warning about greed and sin, while skeptics dismissed it as hysteria born from isolation and superstition. But even skeptics refused to camp there. In a broader sense, the tragedy forced Missouri and much of rural America to confront an uncomfortable truth about itself. For decades, stories of curses and monsters had been used to explain away human cruelty. It was easier to believe in beasts than to admit that desperation, jealousy, and fear could turn neighbors into killers. The Sasquatch curse, then, wasn't proof of a monster hiding in the trees. It was proof of how far people would go to hide from what they'd done. By the time the story made its way into newspapers and books, it had already become distorted. The vanished tribe was now legend, part ghost story, part moral tale. But beneath the embellishments, something real remained, something raw and unresolved. The woods still stand in the Ozarks, untouched by progress, still eerily quiet. And sometimes, when hunters go missing or when the fog rolls in too thick to see your own hands, locals say it feels like the forest is remembering. Perhaps justice was never meant to come through courts or headlines. Perhaps it came through isolation, through the land itself reclaiming what was taken. The story of the vanished tribe isn't just about a mystery in the woods. It's about what happens when fear becomes faith, when guilt becomes legend, and when people look into the darkness and see something that looks back. Over a century later, the Ozark forest keeps its secrets. But one truth remains clear. The real curse wasn't in the woods. It was in the hearts of the people who walked into them and never came out the same.